The NHL trade deadline is just over a month away, and on today's episode, I'm joined by Stars beat writer Sam Nestler to talk about some potential trade targets that the Stars could go after here over the next few weeks, what it might look like for them to come to Dallas if they'd stay long term, or if they would only be rentals. We talk about all of this and more on today's episode of Locked On Stars.
Your Locked On Stars, your daily podcast on the Dallas Stars. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
Howdy, Stars fans. Welcome back to the Locked On Stars podcast, the only daily podcast covering the Dallas Stars. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I'm your host, Dane Lewis, your local expert on all things Dallas Stars hockey, coming to you on this Wednesday, February 1st. And this episode is brought to you by FanDuel Sportsbook, the official sportsbook of Locked On. Make every moment more and visit fanduel.com/lockedon today to get started. And whether this is your first time here or you are a recurring listener, thank you for stopping by and making Locked On Stars your first listen of the day. Be sure to subscribe to the show on YouTube or follow us on your favorite podcasting platform. Helps out the show and helps it reach new audiences. Hope you guys have been enjoying the content this week. If you haven't listened to yesterday's episode with Saad Youssef, I encourage you to check it out. Great conversation about the biggest surprises of the Star season up to this point. And then today we're chatting with Sam Nestler about some potential trade targets that the Stars could pursue here in the next month before the NHL trade deadline hits in early March. So without any further hesitation, let's jump into today's conversation with Stars beat writer Sam Nestler. Joining me now on today's show, Sam Nestler, writer covering the Dallas Stars. You can check out his work on his Twitter account. He posts his link to the Substack there, where he talks a lot about the stuff that we are going to be talking about here, which is, of course, trade deadline, and it's coming up in about a month, the NHL trade deadline. We've already seen one big fish go off the board, if you will, Bo Horvat, the newest member of the New York Islanders. And I mean, I feel like that's a pretty interesting trade to kick things off. And if that's any indication, we're in for a pretty wild next month. Would you say so, Sam?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that it made sense for them once you realized they were going to sign him. But at first I thought it was a rental and I had no idea what they were doing, but it's still a weird one. So I'm sure we'll be in for some surprises.
Yeah. I mean, that's kind of the first big domino to fall. So it feels like we're, kind of heading in that direction where we're going to see more big names taken off the board and maybe a few medium-sized names as well, guys that might not be the showstoppers, but can certainly contribute to a team looking to make a deep run. And that's kind of what we're here to do today. Present some guys and some arguments for some players to potentially be moved to Dallas, and maybe talk about some pieces, whether that's players, prospects, draft picks that the Stars could potentially move on in order to bolster their roster for a playoff run this spring. And Sam, if you want to get us kicked off and present your first player that you think could maybe find their way to Dallas.
Yeah, absolutely. So real quick, the weird thing about their trade deadline is that there's no it's not just like, here's what they need, here's what they have. It's like they're accruing cap space. They kind of need, there's obviously a forward issue. They kind of maybe need a D, but do they need them further than this year? Because they got a lot of young guys coming up. So it's like a weird place they're in where it's not just like, get this guy, sign him, whatever it is. And we know how nil is with rentals. So you never know. He's not gonna put out a ton for rentals. So
that's true.
For me, I kind of have two groups. I have if they were to want to sign someone, or at least someone has 1 or 2 years left on their contract past the rental. So I'll start with those guys. The big one is Timo Meier. That's the big name now. I think that's the biggest name on the market now at this point, if you're looking at forwards. But he is $6 million cap hit, so it's expensive. But he's got 28 goals already. He's scored 35 goals last year. He is a goal scorer. He has been for his career. He probably will be for the rest of his career. So he's a great fit. He's an RFA after this season, so he's not extended towards the end of this year. So that's kind of my first one. It's more of an obvious one, but if they could make it work, I mean, he makes every team better.
Yeah, no doubt. And obviously, I think several teams are going to be contending for Timo Meier. Like you said, he scores goals, incredibly skilled and talented player. And if he does make his way to Dallas, who do you think he could best go alongside? Or is that something that you've kind of thought about? I mean, clearly you think you'd want him on the top six, but who do you think he plays alongside? Because I think we're kind of back to a spot now where Rupe Hintz is going to be playing with Pavelski and Robertson again. And that leaves, probably Tyler Seguin, maybe Timo Meier. And who do you think that third might could be that plays alongside those two, if that's a pair that Pete DeBoer and the coaching staff want to roll with, if this happens?
Yeah, you could throw in like Marchment on that line, but for me, I actually just wrote about this today. I would love to see Ben and Sagan together again with a solidified winger versus just kind of blending Gurionov or whoever might be if thrown in there. Because we forget, like those guys had insane chemistry, and both of them are having much better years than last year. So I know that third line with Ben and Johnston and Delandria has been good, but if you could put Ben, Sagan, and Meier, and then have maybe Marchment, Johnston, Delandria, or some type of mix below that, I think that's worth it. Just because Marchment's had such a hard time, he hasn't scored in forever. He's maybe hitting that wall. He's never played more than 54 games, so like he's right around that point. So it's really hard to say like, all right, if we do have someone like Meier, that's going to just all of a sudden make Marchment good. So it's a tough call, but I would say one or the other. I would put Sagan with him for sure, and then potentially Ben or Marchment would be my next pick.
Yeah, no doubt. I think that's really interesting, and I think Sagan and Ben could certainly work well together. We've seen it historically throughout their time here in Dallas, and yeah, it'd be interesting to see how the coaching staff looks to shake things up, and can Wyatt Johnston continue to produce the way he is if Jamie Benn's not there? Certainly an intriguing prospect, and I'll go kind of the same route. A guy that maybe is a little bit of a long shot. The cap hit not too much different. The $6.1 million cap hit for this guy who will be a UFA at the end of this season. From the Eastern Conference, Dylan Larkin, the current captain of the Detroit Red Wings. It's an interesting situation because obviously he's similar to Bo Horvat, the captain of the team, and a very, very good player for them. But the Red Wings don't really seem to be heading anywhere, long term this season in terms of the playoff race. The Atlantic is just an absolute gauntlet, and there hasn't, from what I've seen, been too much discussion on an extension for Larkin, although that could come down the line. But I'd be curious to see if Detroit looks to maybe move on from him and try to acquire, with draft picks, prospects, things like that. I know the Stars don't have a ton in terms of picks at the moment, but I know there's a decent prospect pool. And I feel like the question, then becomes, are you willing to, sell some big prospect names in return for a player who's 26 years old, leading his team in scoring, has been an effective player? Yeah, it just kind of depends on who you ask. But I feel like Meier might be a little bit more likely, but I feel like Dylan Larkin's a guy who isn't getting as much attention as the deadline approaches, mainly just because I think a lot of people imagine he stays in Detroit. But I feel like you also just never know, again, with how bizarre the trades can be. And Detroit's just in this weird spot where they thought they were going to be competitive this year. They started out that way, and they've regressed a little bit.
Yeah, I think in general, Larkin, Meier, all those guys, anybody that would need to be signed again, I think the way the Stars look at it, and probably most teams, Jim Nill would give up some big names for Dylan Larkin or Timo Meier to be on their team and signed. It's just whether or not they prefer a Dylan Larkin over the prospects that could be ready at that point. That's kind of the decision. So if they're planning on signing, or if they sign someone who has, or trade for someone who has a year or two left, then I think they'll give up more for it. And I mean, Dylan Larkin is an incredible player. I don't know that he moves. Detroit, like you said, is like they thought they're going to be competitive, but also like he's the face of the team. So if they're still rebuilding and maybe they're a couple of years out, they have a lot of good young players. So I would keep that guy. But you're right. They could say, hey, we have 3 years ahead of us. Let's get what we can for it. But I mean, what a great fit. Similar player to Meier, I think. Speedy, can score goals. So I would love to see that in a Dallas lineup.
Yeah, I think the only tricky part is he's listed only as a center. You could adjust his game to where he plays wing, but then at that point, it's where do you slot him into the lineup? Because I think center might be the most stable spot on the Stars roster as far as at least forwards go. I mean, you have four guys that can handle that job and handle that role pretty well, but I feel like that's a good problem to have if you add a guy like Larkin.
Absolutely, yeah. And I think Sagan's pretty comfortable playing on the wing, and nowadays, especially in DeBoer's system, it is kind of fluent. Like Dellandrea played some center, Sagan played some center when they were together. So I don't think that would hold him back. But you're right, it would just solidify that group even more.
Yeah. Really, the only thing that I just kind of noticed looking at Detroit's lineup, it's a bunch of guys that play wing and a few centers, and then Larkin's one of two listed that is only a center. So just an observation, but those are kind of some of the long shots, if you will, guys that might be highly in demand across the league. But if the Stars end up getting those guys, great, and if not, you can probably settle for some other guys. Like last season, we saw the Stars make some moves for guys like Vlad Nemestikov, not the biggest name, but a pretty good contributor. So who's up next on your list, Sam? Today's episode of Locked On Stars is brought to you by FanDuel. We're really excited about our new sports betting partner for Locked On because they are the #1 sportsbook in America. And if you're new to FanDuel, that's even better because they have so many great features that make betting on sports both fun and easy. Download FanDuel right now so you can bet on the Super Bowl 57, with a no-sweat first bet where you'll get up to $3,000 back in bonus bets if your bet doesn't win. FanDuel lets you bet on everything from the money line to point spreads to who will score a touchdown. If it's me and I'm placing money on this, I'm saying Travis Kelce is scoring at least one, if not more, touchdowns for the Kansas City Chiefs on Super Bowl Sunday a couple weeks from now. FanDuel Sportsbook has an app that is both safe and secure and super easy to use. And best of all, you can get paid with your winnings instantly. So join FanDuel today at FanDuel.com/lockedon to claim your no-sweat first bet on Super Bowl 57. That's FanDuel.com/lockedon. Make every moment more with FanDuel, the official sportsbook partner of the NFL and the Locked On Stars podcast.
Yeah, first I'll say there's a bunch of those. I'm not going to get too deep into those that are kind of under the radar. You got Athanasiou, you got Puljujärvi if you believe he can still do it. So there's a lot of guys that are very low risk. But to me, that's a dangerous game for a team that's already not scoring enough below their top line. It's like, do you really trust a guy who hasn't scored more than 2 goals all year? You kind of already have a couple of those. So
yeah.
I wouldn't risk that even if it's for low, but there is a bunch of those. You're right. Nemestikov's a perfect example of someone who can help you in the playoffs. That's not the big name that's going to, break the bank open. But for me, another one, this one's more realistic, is Max Domi. Domi's a similar guy. He scores everywhere he goes. He hasn't, for some, I don't really know why he hasn't stuck around. He's kind of had the similar, bounce around a little bit here and there with teams, but he seems to just score goals. So maybe there's an issue off the ice that makes him move teams, or maybe something else we don't know about. But he's got 14 goals and 21 assists already in this season in only 48 games. So he's a much more productive player than what the Stars currently have been putting out on their top 6. And I think he's only a $3 million cap hit, and it would be a rental most likely. That's where it kind of gets tricky, is that's the kind of player who would most likely be a rental. But he would provide a lot of scoring for them in the playoffs.
Yeah, absolutely. He's a guy I had marked down. I had him and Andres Athanasiou as well from Chicago. I think the Blackhawks are drawing a lot of attention because of Patrick Kane and Jonathan Toews. And while I imagine those guys could very much be moved, I don't necessarily see them coming to Dallas because their cap hits are, through the roof, even higher than, a guy like Meier or Larkin. But yeah, Domi, only that $3 million cap hit, 27 years old. I think it's the perfect storm of the cap hit isn't, out of the water, like blown out of the water. 27, so he has some veteran experience, and I think could mesh well in a locker room that already has some pretty good stability. And then you mentioned the goal scoring. He's not a guy who's really struggled to score goals. 14 goals isn't too bad on a Chicago Blackhawks team that is at the bottom of the standings. So you add that to a top 6, and I think that boosts the offense up a little bit. And Athanasiou, not too far off, a little bit less production, only 10 goals this season, but same cap hit at $3 million, 28 years old. So there's a little bit of, the veteran presence there too. I think it's, you want to find a guy that has some youthfulness left and still has plenty left in the tank, whether it's a rental or long-term, but you also don't want to go, to get a guy that is really more beneficial off the ice than on. You need a little bit of both. And so I think both of those guys would be good. Yeah. And I think it's interesting. I feel like Max Domi has always just been on the move, and I feel like he very well could be again. And I think that was kind of the plan with the Blackhawks going into this season, just with the state that they're in.
Yeah, absolutely. It's kind of like a Taylor Hall situation where the guy's good, but for some reason he just doesn't find a spot anywhere. That's why I think he's purely a rental. I don't think that this is any. I don't think where he lands is where he stays.
Yeah.
But yeah, like you said, I think he had scored 28 goals a couple years ago. So it's that game where you're like, all right, this guy scored this many goals in 2019 and then scored 4 the next year. Which one are you getting? That's the game with the trade deadline every year.
Yeah. And I think, there's a draw to, coming to Dallas, and that you can look at this team and say, well, the offense is better than it's been in years under Pete DeBoer, and you're seeing guys have, kind of revitalizing their career. Guys like Jamie Benn and even Sagan as of late playing a little bit better, and Robertson, Hintz, Pavelski all still playing at an incredibly high level, even with the new coach. And so I have to imagine that for any player, getting moved, that's exciting for them, because I think they could be able to take their game to a new level once they get settled in. But the next player I'll roll with, I'll switch to the defensive side of the ice. I know there's probably more of a commonly held belief that the Stars will make a move for a forward, and I think that makes a ton of sense. But I think there's also potential we could see an attempt to bolster the defensive core a little bit. And the next guy I have, a defenseman from Vancouver in Luke Schenn, who's 33 years old and only has a cap hit of $850,000 and 2 goals, 14 assists on the year. I think he could be, a decent, producer somewhere in the middle of that defensive lineup if someone were to get injured. Or I know we've kind of, gone through these stretches where Niels Lundqvist or someone is getting healthy scratched, just due to lack of production or needing to take a few games off. And I think Schenn could be a guy that, again, has a good amount of mileage in his NHL career, but also could come in and provide and be a little bit of a playmaker with those 14 assists. And I don't really know who you pair him alongside. I think that, you could kind of shuffle it around. I think the defensive side of the ice has been a little bit of a revolving door for the Stars, maybe outside of Lindell and Hakanpää. I just feel like they've been playing alongside each other a good amount this season. But I think Luke Schenn is certainly a guy that could get some consideration with him being a free agent at the end of this season. And the cap hit, certainly nothing to be too overly concerned about. And you might not have to give up too much in return.
Yeah, you mentioned it. It's a pretty low risk, and that's the key there. And I think, like you said, the forward seems to be just above on the priority list. But let's be honest, if the Stars could pick 2 people right now, they'd pick a top 6 forward and a top 4 skilled D, because they lost Klingberg, and that's exactly what he was. Mm-hmm. So, but they can't afford that. So you're thinking, okay, one of them, either they do one big, or they do one a little less big and one small, like someone who's in the 850,000 range that they can easily afford, or not easily with their cap, yeah. But easier. So I think that's a good fit. The only thing is what are they looking for in terms of that defender? Because like you said, he's got 2 goals, 14 assists. So he's not breaking, blowing the game open. He's not moving the puck that much, which is what they could use, I think. But then you look at, all right, well then has Hakanpää struggled a little bit defensively? Could that fix that? And maybe, it's a balancing act. But I'll bounce right off of yours, because I have a defender on my list as well. Like I said, I don't think they do both, and I definitely don't think they do a big defender, which is what I have. But I just wanted to put it on there because it would fit really well, and that's Shane Gostisbehere from Arizona. I feel like he's similar. He's always seems to be on the trade list every year. He had a couple bad years after he was like all that in Philly his first couple of years. But this year he's been better. He had 15 goals and 37 assists last year. So big year last year. This year he's got 9 goals and 20 assists already. So he's producing. He's a 4.5 million cap hit. So again, that's where it's troubling, is that they would have to decide on a lower end forward and get him if they wanted to do it that way. But I think the D is kind of the underrated part here, where everyone's going to be looking at which forward do they get, and they could just sneak in and grab a pretty solid defender as well.
Today's episode of Locked On Stars is also brought to you by our friends at Built Bar. Are you looking for a delicious treat but don't want all of the fat and calories? Then you've got to try Built Bar. We just got through the holidays about a month ago, and I know my goal, as well as many others, is to eat healthier this year. And if you're like me and want to eat healthier but don't want to compromise taste, then you've got to try Built Bars. With Built Bars, they actually make healthy and tasty a reality together. They are so delicious, you won't think that they're good for you, but they're actually the perfect food for your New Year's resolution. What makes the Built Bar taste so good? Well, for starters, they're covered in 100% real chocolate. And they also come in unbelievably delicious flavors like churro, peanut butter brownie, and coconut almond, just to name a few. And if you go to Walmart or Sam's Club, you can buy your own at the store today. You can also order your own box at built.com. Get a 13 bar box with many of the hit flavors like brownie batter and churro. Be sure to give Built Bar a try today at built.com or your local Walmart or Sam's Club. Yeah, I had Goss Despair and both Jacob Chikrin also listed as well as potential targets. I know he's been in trade talks really since the offseason, and he's playing pretty well with the Coyotes, but I think both those guys could be on the move. And we know that Dallas and Arizona have a pretty recent history with trades with the Scott Wedgwood deal last season. I think the only, and it's not really a fear, but the only thing that comes to my mind with Arizona is just where they are as an organization. They're gonna want draft picks and they're gonna want prospects because they're building up, and the Stars, with that Niels Lundqvist trade, don't have their first round pick. I think they gave up this year's third round pick in that trade for Wedgwood, which now I think the Blackhawks own that pick. So the picks front could make things a little bit tricky. I think with these, some of these bottom teams that with a draft as loaded as this one, I think that that's something to consider. And you also maybe don't want to give up a Stankoven or, even a player like Maverick Bork. I think that's something that will be considered by the front office of, the risk and reward of giving up the pieces of the farm for players that could make an impact, immediately or maybe even be around long term.
Yeah, I think you said it perfectly. I think that unless it's some perfect Erik Karlsson keeping half his salary, crazy fit where the guy's going to be a really big player for them for a while, Stankoven, Johnston, Bork, those guys aren't going anywhere. And I would even go as far to say Grushnikov and Harley and some of those other guys as well. They just believe so much, and they've had so much success with their draft picks lately that I don't think they would risk losing one of those guys unless it's some massive deal that gets them a all-star level player. But yeah, I completely agree with you.
Definitely. And it's interesting you mentioned Thomas Harley. We can come back to a few more trade targets potentially in a minute, but just curious to hear what you think about his game. He's having a good year with the Texas Stars. I believe he's been selected to the AHL All-Star game and having a very productive season. Do you think we see him at all at the NHL level this year? I know obviously you have the people that want to see him over some other current players on the NHL roster. It's easier said than done, but I mean, do you think we see him at all this year? I know there was a little bit of that expectation during training camp that he might make that jump fully to the NHL, but we haven't seen it yet. Do you think there's that possibility at all?
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely possible. It's tough because then you'd have to figure out who moves. They're not going to take Suter out of the lineup. Sorry, I'm announcing that to everyone now. As long as he's on the Dallas Stars, he will be in the lineup. So you look at, okay, where do we put Hanley? What do we do? Is Niels ready? Because Harley's having a good year, but I think it's because of what they did. They made him focus all on defense for like 25 games. Didn't put him on the power play or anything like that. He got his defensive game up to where they wanted it, and now he's getting rewarded with some more power play, and he's playing really well. So it's almost like, unless we think he could really come in and help us, and so far he has not done that in the NHL. He hasn't been good in the NHL when he's played for most of his stretches. So unless it's like a big time we really feel it, I almost think they just trust the process and ride it out for the full season here.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to follow along with that because, yeah, like you said, he's getting better as the year goes on and getting rewarded with more responsibility. And maybe that will just come to fruition next season when the roster looks a little bit different and there might be a spot for him. But yeah, the defensive core, very, very interesting with the Stars. And I know Ryan Suter, always a hot topic of discussion if you're scrolling through Twitter during games. But yeah, I'm right there with you. I never see him coming out of the lineup. And, you got to take the good moments and celebrate those when they happen, and maybe look away when there's the bad moments, because they are bound to happen with a guy that's a little bit older, but he's doing what he can, and thankfully we have some other defensive players who can pick up the slack. And kind of we can go one or two more guys each for us. And the last guy I have listed as a potential trade target, another maybe low risk guy, not the biggest numbers, but also playing again on a lower team in Arizona. Nick Ritchie, 27-year-old left wing, only $2.5 million cap hit, 9 goals through 47 games. Again, not the biggest numbers, but I think you always have to consider that if a player is making a jump from a team that's tanking for a number 1 pick to moving to, a team that's top of the conference, that there could be, an adjustment in numbers. And again, I think there's that nice mixture of a cap hit that you can work with, a decent amount of experience in their career, but also some production with 12 assists as well. Maybe not the answer. And I don't think that this, if this is the only move the Stars make, I think it could be an underwhelming deadline. But with other players that get taken by other teams, things that the Stars can't control, a guy like Ritchie might be one of the few options that the team has.
Yeah, well, first of all, as Gary Bettman said, nobody tanks, which is not true. But yeah, you're right. And Ritchie, I believe, I don't remember exactly, but I think he had a really good playoff year for someone. I don't know if it was Toronto or someone one year where he scored a bunch of goals in like a 2-round series or 2 rounds of the playoffs. But yeah, you're right, and he's proven it a little bit. The Stars have the connection with Ritchie since they had his brother Brett here for a few years, more than a few years, and they drafted Brett Ritchie. So it could work, yeah. But you're right. That's another one of those like at an Athens CU where that would be perfect to solidify, a bottom 6 most likely. But then you wonder, okay, you solidified your bottom 6. Who are you thinking is going to be that top 6? And that's the big question. It would be great if one of those guys would just be that, if Dennis Gurianov would just be himself from a few years ago, or if Marchment could find his way back to what he was earlier this year, then it's like, okay, problem solved. Let's get a depth guy and we're good. But that's a good one. I like that because the connection is always huge. It's way bigger than people think. If you have a connection with a team, an agent, a player, whatever, DeBoer's connections with some of the Sharks guys, that goes a really long way.
Yeah, for sure. And I mean, at the end of the day, that's sometimes what can make or break a big deal is those connections. And I think there's benefits to having guys like Pete DeBoer, who's been around for so long and played for coached for several different teams rather. And, even players like Joe Pavelski, who spent years in San Jose, or, Luke Glendening, all those years in Detroit. You never know when things like that can factor into the decisions that get made. Do you have any other guys on the list? Maybe one more guy?
Yeah, absolutely. And I just realized that one thing I was thinking about is with Timo Meier is Pete DeBoer talks about Timo Meier a lot. He mentions him as an example all the time for developing as a young player. So just something to keep in mind that could be a benefit. But yeah, for me, I kind of have 2 guys that are very similar. With another Shark, Kevin Labanc. I don't know how you say his name. I think it's Kevin Labanc, but he's a similar player to Meier in the sense of he's going to be a skilled winger. He can slot in. He's proven that he is most likely a top 6 guy. He's got 1 year left on his deal, so that's where that kind of comes into question there. But he's got 10 goals and 15 assists already. He had 39 assists a couple years ago, so he's a playmaker. He would help Sagan out a lot. He's a 4.7, so he's a good amount less than Meier if that was the kind of big issue there. And then the other guys that are similar to that is the Travis Konechny and Ivan Barbashev. Barbashev is always a question because you don't know whether or not the division teams are going to, trade. Like people mentioned Tarasenko or Ryan O'Reilly, and you're like, I don't see the Blues dealing someone big to a team they might play in a playoff if they were to make it. But those are just other guys that all of those guys are kind of in that similar boat to me, where it would really help the team. They're not super expensive. You're not figuring out a way to toss out an $8 million cap hit or anything like that. They should bring plenty of offense right away. So I'd be really excited to see any of those guys. I mean, any of the top kind of 4 that we listed there would really, really significantly help the team. And then you got a couple guys that would be good additions. But it's going to be so interesting to see what Neil is able to figure out, because he's very sneaky. He always has been. So he surprises us all the time. I mean, who thought that they were going to pick up Wedgwood and how big that was going to be for them? So he does those moves a lot, which is why me and you talk about this. We never knock anyone out, besides maybe Erik Karlsson. Everybody's on the table for a Stars team as long as they have the will to want to win. And it feels like they really, really think they have a chance to win this season.
Definitely. I think that is the belief in the organization and especially in the locker room. And I think you can even just tell by Joe Pavelski re-signing for one more season after this. I mean, I don't think you stick around and continue to play as many years as he has in the league. I mean, I think you only stick around if you think that the room that you're playing with and those guys have a chance to do something special. So I think, yeah, like you said, you never really know what Jim Nill's going to do. He's shown very recently that he's a very capable GM. I mean, he can draft, he can negotiate and get those the deals redone for guys like Hintz and Heiskanen. And I think even down the line, I think Ottinger and Robertson are due for some pretty significant, upgrades in pay. And you threw out Travis Konechny's name, and I think that's an easier said than done deal. But I mean, if you had a guy like him, I think he'd be getting talked about a lot more if he was on a team that wasn't the Flyers. 24 goals, 25 assists in 45 games. I mean, he's over a point per game as a player. I mean, that would just be outstanding. I think he's a guy that could play on a top line for most teams, but the Stars would, be getting him probably on a second line, playing that wing position with Tyler Seguin. And I think those two could definitely wreak some havoc.
Yeah, and he actually plays a similar game, not too similar to Stankoven, but he's gets in the corners, he digs pucks out, he's a little bit gritty, which is exactly why Marchment and Foxa and those guys have been put on Sagan's line, is because they feel he needs someone like that to dig the puck out and find him, an open spot. So I think it's just a perfect fit. It is a decent sized cap hit, and he does have a year left, so there's a lot of complications. But that name, once I started looking a little deeper into him, that really kind of stuck up, because he's basically scored 20 goals every year in his career.
Yeah, very good player. Very, I think, underrated again, just because of the team he plays on and the kind of season that Philadelphia is having. Not at the top of many news story headlines in terms of making a push for the playoffs in that Metro division, but again, Jim Nill tends to surprise a lot of people with the moves he makes, and I have no doubt that in a month or so from now we could be having conversations about, man, Jim Nill's done it again. They have player X or player X and Y, and that they're geared up, the Stars are, for a potential deep run. And this is kind of that exciting time of year where the teams are separated and we have the contenders, the teams that are locked for the playoffs, and it's just a matter of how deep they'll go, and the other teams that are going to be selling, looking towards the future and the pieces that they're willing to part ways with.
Yeah, and you just mentioned that teams are separating themselves. How nice is it that we're not talking about the Stars are 1 point out of the playoffs, or the Stars are 1 point in the bubble, or what? It's just nice to be to have them in a spot looking at what can make us better versus what do we need to get that 8th spot and make the playoffs.
Yeah, and that's what it was last year. That's exactly where we were last year. It was, are we even going to make the playoffs? And now it's almost like, I think this team, as they are, could already go pretty deep, but the idea of them getting better is very exciting.
Yeah, it's a different deadline when you're looking at how can we get past that Western Conference Final Stanley Cup versus how can we get to the first round and maybe through it. It's just a different feeling.
Yeah, and now it's really, how can we get through the Western Conference? Of course, there's its own obstacles there, but man, whoever's on the other side of that matchup in the finals out east is Boston, Carolina. That's going to be very, very difficult. But I mean, if the Stars make the right moves, I think they can compete with just about anybody.
Yeah, I'm excited to watch I don't usually watch super closely the Eastern Conference playoffs, but this year I'm watching every series because those games are going to be crazy. You're going to have like multiple recent Stanley Cup champions playing each other in the first round and second round.
Yeah, absolutely. And even, teams like Tampa, Toronto, I know Toronto gets a lot of slack, but I mean, they're a good team this year and they always lose in the first round, but they're always competitive first round series. So regardless of if they win or not, it should be a good 5, 6, 7 games. But yeah, the Eastern Conference is going to be good. I think the West will be entertaining too. Maybe not as thrilling of some offensive games, but again, it depends on what other moves that teams make. But Sam, thank you so much for joining today. If you want to take a moment, I know, try to give you guys an opportunity to come on to let the people know where they can find you on social media, where they can find your work if they're not already aware of where they can find all that.
Yeah, absolutely. You mentioned earlier my most of my stuff's on my Substack, which I believe is just samnestler.substack.com, or just go through my Twitter at Sam Nestler. It has all my information on there. But thanks for having me, man. This is always a good time, so I appreciate it.